Perfect. Okay, well, welcome everyone to our second session of Peatfest. We're really happy to have you join us. We just had a really nice discussion at the first session, and I'm sure this one is going to be the same. So thank you all for being here. So joining us now for this session is Dr. Kenneth Nsah, who is widely known under his pen name Nsah Mala. He's a writer, poet, journalist, translator, and literary scholar from Cameroon. And now I'm going to get even more out of breath while I read out his research interests, because there's quite a few. So we have environmental humanities, eco-criticism, energy humanities, health humanities, the climate environment migration nexus, comparative African literature in English and French, Cameroonian literature, education for sustainable development, youth climate activism, and more. So I know that for sure we're going to have a really interesting session today. And so the session itself is going to be focusing on this intersection between eco-criticism, fortress conservation, and peatlands in the Congo Basin. So kind of using the environmental humanities and literature in the session to kind of analyze these things, and especially with the Congo Basin being quite a hot topic at the moment, I suppose, in climate narratives. It's, of course, a really interesting discussion that we'll have on this today. And then I'll hand over to you, Kenneth, to introduce yourself further and to just get going with the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany, for inviting me. Thank you to you and your entire team at RE-PEAT for the work you are doing on peatlands and related ecosystems, and for extending this invitation to me. I think you've offered a very generous introduction of me that I wouldn't want to add to it. I would prefer that at the end of my talk, we can then further discover ourselves in the Q&A, in the discussion. So without further ado, I would rather prefer to start my talk now. But just before I do that, I have to share my screen. So can you please confirm if you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
See it.
Okay, thank you. One little thing is I'm trying to see where I can hide the... Okay, yeah, I think I found a little solution. I hope it works. So the title of my talk today is PostColonial Ecocriticism, Fortress Conservation and Peatlands in the Congo Basin. I'm going to try to talk about a lot of things in a short time, but I also do hope that these are things that are quite interconnected, just in the way that we are entangled with nature, including the peatlands that we are discussing today and their rights. Sorry, I have to, okay. So here is a picture of an area view of just part of the Congo Basin. But then just what is the Congo Basin? This is the second largest tropical rainforest in the world after the Amazon, usually called the second lung of the earth. And when we call it the second lung of the earth, it is because we assume that it is believed that the Amazon is the first lung of the earth. But again, there is growing evidence that because of higher levels of deforestation in the Amazon, that the Congo Basin is now the first lung, or is almost becoming the first lung of the earth. And the Congo Basin is found in Central Africa, and it cuts across 6 countries, including Cameroon, where I come from, Gabon, Central African Republic, the Republic of Congo or Congo Brazzaville, and then the Democratic Republic of the Congo or Congo Kinshasa, are usually abbreviated as DRC, and Equatorial Guinea. The Congo Basin is estimated at about 1.7 billion square meters, and it drains an area approximately the size of Western Europe. And it is home to thousands of bird species, about 700 species of fish, about 400 species of mammals, about 10,000 species of tropical plants, and 80% of these are native to the Congo Basin tropical rainforest. And it is actually estimated that the Congo Basin rainforest or tropical rainforest ecosystems harbor 10% of the global biodiversity. And then you can see that it's not just about the biodiversity, but it's also about the cultural diversity, because we are talking about a basin that is home to about 75 million people from different ethnicities, roughly 150 ethnicities or ethnic groups, including indigenous people who depend on the basin for their food, for their fresh water, for their shelter, for their medicine, for their economic survival and other forms of needs. And the Congo Basin is also quite a popular place for mineral resources like crude oil, diamond, cobalt, copper, timber, uranium, etc. And its importance goes beyond biodiversity, cultural diversity, and minerals, but also into climate action, because this is a place with enormous potential, enormous capacity for carbon sequestration through the forest of the basin, but also through the peatlands of the basin, which are estimated to store about 30 billion tons of CO2. That's roughly 3 years of global carbon emissions. So I'll be coming back to the peatlands later on in my talk today. And then another key statistic is that annual emissions absorbed by African tropical rainforest are thrice more than those of the UK annual emissions. And of these, 3/4 of them are actually absorbed by the Congo Basin. But of course, the Congo Basin is under threat, like the rest of the world, but each place is under threat for different reasons. And in the Congo Basin, it is, of course, anthropogenic climate change, which the basin can fight, but the basin is also vulnerable to it. And then other human activities or factors, such as industrialization in the global north, ecological transition in the global north, and then mining, oil drilling, logging, agriculture, wildlife trafficking, demographic growth, urbanization, etc., etc. All of these are factors that are contributing to the destruction of the Congo Basin, including its peatlands. And then, of course, the Congo Basin, because of all these different facets of its importance, is at the center of climate diplomacy. It is a geopolitical hotspot for political, economic, ecological, climate, neo-colonial interests. So a lot of interests are clashing over the Congo Basin, including neo-colonialist or neo-colonial interests, capitalist interests. And of course, that is why we see that the Congo Basin is increasingly becoming, alongside the Amazon and the forests in Southeast Asia, they are getting a central position in the COP negotiations. And for example, we can think about the forest deal that was reached in Glasgow last year at COP26. And industrialized nations are, of course, expected to pay for the preservation of such rainforest, like the Congo Basin, especially given the fact that Africa, where the Congo Basin is found, and much of the global south have contributed quite insignificantly to the carbon emissions, to the greenhouse gases that have caused the climate crisis, the climate emergency we are facing today. And so, and then we need to preserve these places to mitigate the climate, to act on the climate. And so for this, there is a growing consensus, or a growing consensus among African stakeholders and similar stakeholders for the compensation for such eco services or nature-based services. And so one of the first countries in the global north that has started respecting these commitments is Norway, because Norway started last year in 2021 to pay some money to Gabon as one of the best countries in the Congo Basin in terms of its forest and landscape management. And then, of course, I look at these issues from a theoretical perspective known as ecocriticism, and more specifically known as post-colonial ecocriticism. And this falls within the broader domain, or the broader disciplinary area of environmental humanities. And environmental humanities generally is, we bring methods approaches and concepts from the humanities, whether anthropology, sociology, history, literary studies, etc., to look at or to examine, to study, and to contribute to addressing environmental and climate change concerns. Originally, ecocriticism was defined as the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment. That was by Glodfelty and Fromm. But the definition and even the practice of the field has evolved over the years. And now it is broadly defined, for example, by Scott Slovic as being the study of explicit environmental text by way of any scholarly approach, or conversely, the scrutiny of ecological implications and human-nature relationships in any literary text or other form of human cultural expression, even texts that seem at first glance oblivious of the non-human world. So in other words, any conceivable style of scholarship becomes a form of ecocriticism if it's applied to certain kinds of literary works. And on the other hand, there is not a single literary work anywhere that utterly defies ecocritical interpretation, or in other words, that is off limits to a green reading or an earth-centered approach. So ecocritical theory is anchored on, and it promotes theoretical eclecticism or ecumenism. And by this, we mean that in ecocriticism, including the other branches or sub-branches of it, like post-colonial ecocriticism, like ecofeminism, like empirical ecocriticism, etc., there is the practice of borrowing methods and borrowing concepts from as many disciplines as possible. So it is both eclectic, it is ecumenical, and it is also transdisciplinary and multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary in its approach. And for my own work, I'm particularly inclined to post-colonial ecocriticism because I come from Cameroon in Africa, a continent that witnessed the brutality of colonization and even ongoing neo-colonization or neo-colonialism in different forms. And so for this reason, post-colonial eco-critics argue for paying attention to indigenous and to post-colonial realities, as well as difference, interconnection, and issues of exploitation in its engagement, or even domination in its engagement with the literary and other artistic text. So there is a strong need for the recognition of difference, and in the same breath for interconnection. That is what Egia tells us, and he sees it as the greatest strength of post-colonial eco-criticism. That is to strike a balance between the notion of difference and that of interconnection. Therefore, for him, this remains the ultimate aspiration of a national eco-criticism that is constitutive of post-colonial eco-criticism. Briefly, it means for post-colonial eco-criticism, there is the need to look at the parallels between post-colonial studies and eco-critical studies, and look at the conditions of formerly colonized or presently neo-colonized subjects and peoples of the world, in terms of also how humanity in its different shapes and forms and to different degrees has been has projected itself in relation to the rest of nature that we form part of. And in the current age, according to Morford, in the current age of climate change, global warming, species extinction, unequal access to resources and services, environmental and social injustice, the acidification of oceans, the Anthropocene, and geopolitical tensions between the North and the South, eco-critics generally agree that the most important challenge in pragmatic, theoretical, imaginary, and cognitive terms is to address both global and local issues. And that's why we are not surprised by slogans about the Congo Basin, such as un enjeu global, un enjeu local et global, or un enjeu local et planétaire, which means a stake or a challenge, a local challenge and a global challenge, or a global stake and a local stake, because we are simultaneously dealing with issues that affect people, individuals and collectives and communities in specific locations of the world, that is locally, and these are also issues that travel without respect to boundaries, issues that are quite transnational in the approach, because a heating planet, rising ocean waters, just to give two examples, are things that know no boundaries. I am sorry, I'm trying to, there's something that pops up on my screen and then it blocks parts of my my slides. I'm trying to figure it out. And so too, another issue would be to, from this perspective of post-colonial eco-criticism in my work, in my past work, and also in my ongoing work, I've been looking at issues such as fortress conservation in the Congo Basin, which is a practice that is quite rampant across much of Africa and elsewhere in the global south. So what is fortress conservation? You know, fortress conservation is this form of nature protection that is premised much, so much on violence, on displacement and violence, typically erecting fortresses or erecting fortifications, that is erecting barriers in places that were formerly inhabited by humans and non-humans alike, including other species of animals and plants, people like indigenous people, people like local people, and coming and suddenly telling them that they have to move to leave their ancestral homes because they have been conceived of, they have been constructed to be a danger, to be a threat to a place where they have been living for millennia, for the years that we cannot count. And so because this is a way, this perpetuates a lot of not only violence, but also different forms of injustice to the people concerned in such areas that come under militarized protection. But for us to understand this, environmental humanities and eco-criticism helps us to look at this, to trace this backwards into history. And some of the explanations, the justifications for such an approach, because for example, this is not how nature protection is done in Europe. If you go to a national park in France, you will find people living in it. But if you go to a national park in Congo or in Cameroon, people are perceived there as ultimate threats and dangers, and often people can be brutalized, and sometimes people are even killed because they are being forced to leave those kinds of places. And so why so? Because first, they have these stereotypical images that have built up not only in Africa but elsewhere, that there has been colonization. The image of the dark continent of Africa. You know, Africa was seen by colonialists as being a primeval, bestial, reptilian, or a female entity to be tamed, enlightened, guided, opened, and pierced by white European males through Western science, through Christianity, civilization, commerce, and colonialism. That's one of the reasons behind this. And it's also even quite similar to the way that Americans said that migrant Americans treated indigenous people in America during the creation of parks there. And then also, of course, writers have picked up this, colonialist writers like Joseph Conrad, who wrote a novel known as The Infamous Heart of Darkness. So he fed on this kind of racist depictions of Africa as a heart of darkness. And that was due to the above reasons, but also to the, in quotes, harsh climate and diseases of sub-Saharan Africa to colonialism. And so Conrad fits on this to write his stereotypical novel about the Congo, in which he treats humans as being brutes. And Achebe, one of Africa's most celebrated novelists, responded to Conrad by writing his classical novel, Things Fall Apart, in where he tries to reclaim or to point to the dignity and to the dynamism of African societies as represented by his Igbo community prior to the brutal colonial encounter. And of course, the myth of an Eden in Africa to be protected that fits fortress conservation is built into the idea of these national parks that I was mentioning a few minutes ago. And this can be traced particularly to the Yellowstone Park, National Park in the USA in 1872. And from there to the first national park that was created in Africa and again in the Congo Basin, which is the Virunga National Park, created in 1925 by the Belgian colonialists in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So the racism and the brutality that accompanied the creation of parks like Yellowstone in America, the kind of brutality and racism that were meted out or that orchestrated and underpinned the creation of these vis-a-vis the indigenous Amerindians, was later brought to Africa by European colonialists, and it led to or inspired the creation of Virunga and later on many other parks, because there is actually almost a kind of proliferation of national parks in Africa. Although that is good for biodiversity conservation, but always there are questions of justice and injustice that need to be addressed. And so historians have established these racist origins of both forest conservation, as I've already discussed, and then green imperialism or green colonialism in Africa and even elsewhere. And good examples are French environmental historian, Guillaume Blanc, whose book came out about 2 years ago, known as L'invention du colonialisme vert pour en finir avec le mythe de l'Éden africain. In other words, or literal translation, the invention of green colonialism, ending the myth of an African Eden. And also books, scholars like Richard Grove, who in 1995 published Green Imperialism. And so literary text can help us to portray these kinds of ideas that are underpinning forest conservation in the Congo Basin and elsewhere in Africa. And I use the examples of two texts, just two, and there are many that we could use in terms of portrayal. We take a play like The Last Hope by Cameroonian playwright Ekpe Inyang, and then a novel like Les Marchands du Développement Durable by Congolese author from the Congo Brazzaville, known as Asitu Ndinga, and their text accidentally and deliberately, respectively, portray the colonial racist origins of forest conservation in Africa, a practice, as I've already explained, borrowed from the racist US national park system, which is and was premised on the myth of African nature, forest as pristine Edens to be preserved against barbaric, destructive, and irrational Africans. And here we are talking about the idea of the Eden of Africa is this projection of African forest, African wilderness as being a place that is completely void of any human presence, and which is a complete lie. Because indigenous people, local people, and other people have lived, have moved around much of those places. And so literature also helps us to question these kinds of practices. And that is why when I was talking about sub-disciplines of ecocriticism or even of environmental humanities, others that we can talk about are like blue humanities and also even the emerging field today known as conservation humanities. So what we are doing is that we question these kinds of things because we think that it's time to reflect on them and to modify where it is necessary to modify in order to administer justice where justice is due, because it's a matter of protecting all lives, protecting human lives, protecting non-human lives more than human lives. And so literature helps us to question these kinds of stuff because it creates, especially forest conservation, due to the injustices that it creates. It devalues and it excludes some humans, especially local and indigenous people. And it operates most often through forcible displacement, both physical displacement and spiritual displacement. Because sometimes you can be allowed exceptionally to live in a park, but your interactions with your ancestral homeland are limited in such a way that your religious, your spiritual beliefs and practices are no longer operated. And so you can actually be displaced without moving. So you can be spiritually displaced. And this is an idea that ecocritics have evoked. Ecocritics like Ogaga Okoyade in Nigeria, for example, and other post-colonial ecocritics. And so a text like The Last Hope, novels like Les Marchands du Développement Durable, and a novel like Nkole Yang Bofane's Congo Inc. Bismarck's Testament, Bofane is from the DRC, are good examples that show us how this perpetuates violence and breeds resistance from local and indigenous communities. And so it's important to address these kinds of issues if we want conservation, but also climate action to be more effective. And so now I would like to talk about the Congo Basin peatlands and the aporias of their being or their uses. So, in 2017, the peatlands in the cuvette centrale of the Congo Basin that runs across the two Congos, the Republic of Congo, that's Brazzaville, Congo Brazzaville, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, that's Congo Kinshasa. These peatlands were brought to international attention under the leadership of a British peat expert, Greta Dagi. But the problem, I find this is a great feat. This is something to be celebrated because of the value, the estimated value of these peatlands in terms of carbon sequestration today. But from a post-colonial ecocritical perspective, one begins to think about questioning the narrative of discovery, because if you read all Western popular magazines and newspapers, whether they are BBC or they are The Guardian or they are CNN, you will find that this is actually framed as a story of discovery, the discovery of peatlands. But one can question this from the perspective of the peats, because today we are talking about the rise of peats. Because the first thing is, even like, do the peats agree that they have been discovered? Have the peats not been aware of themselves? That's one perspective from which we could question the narrative of discovery, even though we celebrate the fact that there is more global attention drawn to the peats today. And then another perspective would be even that of the locals and the indigenous, because saying that peatlands have been discovered when there are indigenous people who have been interacting with the peatlands, fishing in the peatlands, and sometimes farming or harvesting from the peatlands, is in some senses problematic, and also in a sense ties in with some previous narratives of discovery about Africa. A very ridiculous thing would be the previously famous narrative of a certain Mongo Pack having discovered River Niger, a river that runs across many countries in Africa today, and that those places were inhabited by people who knew the river, who were with the river, and then someone comes from somewhere else and says he has discovered the river. So I think that discovery is something to be questioned, even when we can all be happy about the benefits of when international or Western attention is brought to something found in other parts of the world. And then, of course, another issue with the peatlands is that now that the peatlands have been brought to attention beyond its immediate vicinity, there are now contested views and claims as to its use, its importance, and its value. Some local and indigenous people have started seeing it as another mineral which is up for new colonial grabs. As Dr. Greta Dagi noted in the New York Times, understandably, given the history of colonialism, the assumption can often be that we are there to prospect for oil minerals. And of course, we have actually seen films, movies, documentaries of people in the areas of the peatlands who are already suspecting that the samples being taken away are actually minerals. And so people have to be transparent and pay their own share for collecting their minerals and going with them. And of course, this is not something that is coming from a vacuum. This is something that can help us to understand the eternal conflicts in northeastern Congo, which is one of the richest parts of the earth in terms of mineral resources. And of course, the peats are now under many kinds of threats. This includes oil exploration and drilling, the commodification of the peatlands, and then climate change itself, etc., etc. There have been news reports, reliable news reports, and also whistleblowing from environmental NGOs that the government of the DRC has been auctioning some parts of forest in the Congo for oil exploration, and many of which run into the peatlands. And this, we can already know what will happen if oil is to be explored and is to be drilled there. First of all, the climate implications of oil alone are enormous, and not to talk about those of now bursting open the kind of bomb-like gases that have been stored for many, many years by these peatlands, and of course, increasing the store of the greenhouse emissions into the global atmosphere. And so one might also begin to wonder or to worry or to think or to ponder if for the reasons and that I've mentioned above and many more, there would be no fortification of the Congo Basin peatlands. Is there going to be some kind of fortress conservation of the peatlands? There is a risk of extending fortress conservation techniques to the peatlands through the construction of local and indigenous people around it as enemies or threats. And this is something we have to watch out, and we have to actually make sure it doesn't happen. I think, as far as I know, most of the scientific teams working on the peatlands so far are quite aware of these things, but we do hope that that awareness continues to grow so that at one point, the indigenous people around the forest, the peatlands, are not constructed and not shaped and perceived as threats and evicted from a place where they have caused actually no damage all along. Because before, whoever came from outside to see those peatlands, in addition to them who have been seeing the peatlands have been there and nothing has been happening to them or done by the people living there. And so instead of a fortress approach, if at all that is something envisaged, I would suggest that local and indigenous people must be kept at the center of all efforts to protect the Congo Basin itself and then the Congo Basin peatlands. Because as we all know, these people have valuable knowledge about its existence up until now. And so I also suggest that, of course, my talk here is just one way of provoking, of inviting more studies on the peatlands from a humanities perspective. I think that more humanities scholars need to accompany the efforts of the scientists who are working on the Congo Basin peatlands, in addition to the indigenous scientists who have been keeping them all these years. And so other approaches, for instance, could include of studies for people from a humanities background like me, could include, for example, studying the indigenous narratives, songs, folk tales, dirges, and every other kind of thing in the communities of the local and indigenous people that have existed up till now, or are even being created now in relation to the peatlands. So the narratives and practices of indigenous people can be looked at. And then another way could also even be to read more in more detail journalistic narratives and documentaries of the peatlands from an ecocritical, from a post-colonial ecocritical perspective, in order to preempt any climate injustice that might occur to humans and non-humans in the Congo Basin and in the Congo Basin peatlands. And so now, as I'm driving closer to the end of my talk, I would like to conclude not with a very usual conclusion. I will suggest instead a poetic conclusion. And what I mean by this is that I'm going to read a poem I wrote not long ago, known as Congo Basin Peatlands, under my pen name Nsah Mala. And I should note that this poem has been translated into Danish and published in a Danish magazine, which is it's actually a magazine talking about wetlands in Denmark and elsewhere. I'm yet to have my copy of it anyway, so I'm waiting for mine in the post any moment from now. So let me conclude our session by reading this poem entitled Congo Basin Peatlands. Congo Basin Peatlands. We are peatlands, the transient lands where the living and the dead commune, where animal plant souls watch the moon, where humans are protected by cosmic hands. We are the living Congo Basin peatlands, swallowing tons of your mortal gases, gushing out from your toxic industrial ashes. We're suiting your auto wounds with our hands. But you've overstepped tolerable limits. You've burst the lids of our ancestral wrath. You've soaked the world in an infernal bath that will burn you and other beings into charred bits, unless you repent from your capitalist greed, unless you atone for your endless industrial sins, unless you refrain from treating our beings as beings, unless you halt loggers, miners, and gazes with speed. Aarhus, 2nd May, 2022. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth. what a way to end with that poem at the end, really going straight to the heart of the matter with colonial greed or capitalist greed, colonial greed also. So now we have some time for questions. If anybody has a question, what you can do now is either put it in the chat if you prefer. You can also put up your hand via the function at the bottom where you can do reactions, and you can put up your hand there. I will give you a minute if somebody wants to already put a question in or put up their hand. Yeah, Irene, you can go for it.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. I was just wondering, with regards to the fortification of the Congo Basin, is there any particular forces that are pushing for this, such as particular businesses, institutions, governments, other actors that are really like trying to make this happen? And on the other side, is there any efforts from the local community or other grassroots initiatives that are pushing against this? And if so, what exactly are they doing?
Thank you. Could you please repeat the first part of your question?
Yeah, I was wondering if there's any particular forces pushing for this fortification of the Congo Basin, like any particular businesses or institutions or governments.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a complex issue and we cannot pin it down to a specific business at this moment, but I think that the whole discourse and narrative of climate finance makes it very possible for the basin and the peatlands that are protecting our nature, our climate, mitigating climate change and protecting all of us and helping us to breathe. But at the same time, there is a little risk or a danger of like saying, well, this payment now puts up nature for kind of sale. You know what I mean? So, and of course, when you look into some NGOs, I don't want to call names, but if you look at the approaches that some NGOs are using, there is a subtle tendency for commodifying different aspects of nature. And that could be through, for example, ecotourism. That could be, for example, of course, through encouraging what is in quotes called more legal and more certified and more, more authorized forms of logging, for example. So this is the greater narrative within which I'm placing this. I don't think that immediately now there is already a particular company that is going to or that has started commodifying it, but I'm just thinking through it as kind of food for thought, as because I think a lot remains to be known about the peatlands, the ecosystems of the peatlands. And so even as we go ahead to uncover more, to learn more from the peatland itself and from the inhabitants of the peatland, which means all the animals that live there, including us animals, because we are all animals. So whether we are indigenous, whether we are non-indigenous, whether we are colonialists, we are all animals who belong to kingdom Animalia, that as we begin to learn from all these people and from all these beings, it will be important to consider the ramifications of what could become or what will happen if we commodify this kind of stuff. And of course, another thing is even what will happen if, because we're already aware of the role of capitalism in the climate emergency, what will happen if we continue to go and sell the kind of way of life that we live today to people who have not opted for it, people who have not signed up for it. Because quite often, because you know, a lot of my talk has been around, I've been speculating. So suppose that the indigenous people are eventually constructed as enemies and driven away from the peatlands where they've been living in harmony for a long time. The next thing is that you will hear that they are sent to schools. And these are people who have not actually written any explicit application and sent it to you or to me saying that we want a school, because they have their own knowledge system. They have their own school system. And the next thing in our school is that we will teach them economics. And the economics will teach them to have to own things. And then once we start owning things, you know the things that happen to nature and the climate crisis. And so it's important rather to respect the other ways of inhabiting the world, the other ways of being in the world, the other ways of knowing the world.
Yeah, it's really where you see that everything is very connected. Always, I was reminded this morning of that film that I haven't seen yet, like Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, just like all these interconnected issues all the time. Bianca, I don't know if you want to ask your question yourself. I can also read it out. I'm going to read it out. So Bianca was wondering if you have any ideas or what's your perspective on assigning rights to the Congolese peatlands based on everything that you've included in your talk, and I'm sure other work that you've done previously. So a little bit about the rights of nature and how that interacts with the Congo Basin.
Yeah, I think that the concept of the rights of nature is one that can be helpful and that can be useful to the protection of the peatlands and also the other beings and constituents of nature in the Congo Basin. But I would suggest that if we are going down the route of the rights-based approach, it would also be important for a starting point to learn about the legal system of indigenous and local people, because when you come to places like different African countries, including Cameroon, where I come from, there are always different kinds of, sometimes complementary, but sometimes conflicting legal systems in operation, like what would be called customary law, which is like our cultural law, the law of, like, if you go to the kingdom where I come from, we have laws that are passed down from the palace in collaboration with other institutions that are in charge of taking those laws and administering them to us, and then also then laws taken in Yaoundé by the parliament. So I would think that in the same way, it would be good if a right approach is taken to look into the laws of indigenous people, local people, the closest people to the Congo Basin peatland, and see if there is an aspect of their laws that is already protecting those, or an aspect of their laws that can be extended to that protection, so that we can end up with a good blend, perhaps, of some kind of Euro-American inspired law, but also, of course, laws that emanate from the people closest to the the basin. So yeah, of course, I agree. I think that a rights-based approach is an important one, but it depends how we go about it and how inclusive or exclusive it is with regards to other forms of legality that remain. And of course, we are all happy that the rights approach has today origins from a place like, I think it's the constitution of is it Ecuador, and that is based actually on insights from indigenous people's practices. So I think that we can also begin to extend that in a very respectful way, that an inclusive way of the indigenous people of the Congo Basin, the local people of the Congo Basin.
Cool. Yeah. Okay, Bianca says thank you. Yeah, I think really understanding then as a tool that can, of course, like any other thing, like carbon credits or other things that we're talking about, it's so shaped by who's implementing it, who's making it, who's the decision maker. The rights of nature being a tool, and then making sure all those caveats are filled, that it is being led by indigenous people, that it is respecting other laws, or putting them at the above hierarchy as well.
Yeah.
I had a question that would be moving a little bit more into kind of youth activism. So I was wondering first if anybody else wants to ask a question more about still rights of nature, rights of peatlands, and then maybe I would kind of steer it a little bit that way. So you can put up your hand or post in the chat now if you want to. Okay, cool. So in the article that you wrote in the conversation, which we'll also share in the chat in a second, you speak about how authors from around the Congo Basin kind of predicted or predicated the emergence of youth activists, such as Greta Thunberg or Vanessa Nakate, for example. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that dynamic and how you see this literature linking with the youth activism.
Yeah, thank you. That's a topic that fascinates me a lot because I'm in a liminal space now. According to the definitions of some countries, now I'm still a youth, and in some countries I may not still be a youth, but I'm very much interested and invested in youth climate activism. And the discussion that I presented briefly in that article, because that article is inspired by my doctoral dissertation, is what I call the prophecy of a youth climate movement, or the prophecy of a time when the young people would take the climate crisis into their hands and say, this is our thing and we have to make this happen. And so I read a number of text plays, but also novels that are woven around young characters, young girls, young boys who are actively fighting against climate change in different dimensions. Because as we all know, within climate change discourses, it is believed that the global south has contributed the least and is the most vulnerable and is already suffering a lot of the impacts. And even within these geographic zones, it's also believed that women and children suffer the most. But then, when this is true, but at the same time, what it doesn't do is that often this erases the agency, the activism, and the resilience and the creativity of these same women and young people who are also often at the forefront of fighting for climate change. So, and that's what I'm trying to do in the literature. I'm reading the text because the text, in a way, fictionalize young climate activists in ways that I argue can influence other young people who read those texts or who watch the plays being performed to get engaged into youth climate activism. So it's a kind of two-way system. It's a way, and I also say this, that I am not belittling or undermining the creativity of the authors, but I also point in my analysis to the fact that these authors, being for the most part people with scientific backgrounds and people who have worked within NGOs, and then reading the literature and saying that even for over 20, 30 years now, UN agencies like UNICEF and others have started sounding the alarm and saying that young people need to be involved as much as possible in fighting climate change, in protecting the environment. One would also think that these scientific sources have inspired the authors. So in a sense, I'm saying, well, and these are authors that believe in the ingenuity of young people, but also people who can transcribe scientific evidence into literary texts in ways that are inspirational, in ways that first celebrate youth climate activism, but also inspire more youth climate activism by showing young people who are already doing it, and then others say, well, if this one can do it, no matter whether this person is a fictional character or not, then I can also do it. So yeah, and of course, even in reality, some of the most vocal voices on the youth climate scene today come from Africa. In addition to Greta Thunberg, that almost everyone knows about in the global north, there are people like Vanessa Nakate in Uganda next door, and there are some definitions of the Congo Basin according to which Uganda is part of it. Because even when we talk about 6 countries, there is another definition of the Congo Basin that can include Rwanda and include Angola and include even Uganda, okay, and even maybe be extended up to Chad, and to an extent, maybe even Nigeria. And so, and there are vibrant young people like Remy Zahiga in the DRC Congo, who are advocating for the protection of the Congo Basin, advocating for climate justice, advocating for the protection of indigenous people. And I think that there is some kind of correlation between this. And of course, to end here on this question, another issue is that these texts that I read, for me, do not only prophesy or predict this coming of a youth movement to take the climate crisis as their cause, but also tries to dismantle barriers, cultural barriers and otherwise barriers that could stand on the way of young people acting or taking climate action. I will explain with just a quick example. In an earlier article that I published in The Conversation, where I was trying to explain why, when you look at Fridays for Future, we look at the number of young people down the streets in, let's say, Oslo or Aarhus or Copenhagen or Paris or London or New York or maybe South Africa in Petrolia or Johannesburg, you find that then comparatively there will be fewer kids in the streets of Kampala, in the streets of maybe Yaoundé, or not at all sometimes. So there is this also idea of the timid mobilization down south as opposed to the up north. And some of the reasons for this include even dictatorial regimes, but of course cultural practices. And now I'm using an example from where I come from. I come from a kingdom called Mbessa. And like Mbessa, many other kingdoms around us are so based or socially structured in such a way that there is so much respect given for the elderly, for age. There is a lot of respect for age, and we generally believe that age comes with wisdom. But one risk with that is that the voices of young people are quite often silenced. And so very often a younger person might have a good idea to contribute in a meeting, but if you come into a meeting with your elders, a meeting with your parents, unless you are explicitly authorized to speak, you're not supposed to speak, because if you just decide to speak anyway, that will be considered as a sign of disrespect. And so texts like these ones that I've read help in that they also try to question those practices by giving voice to the young and pointing to the older persons or to the elderly, that sometimes it's important to listen to the young because they might have the key to unlock the obstacle in front of us. And that is actually happening with the climate crisis, both whether it is in Africa, whether it is in Europe or in America, in Australia and Asia. We are seeing the tremendous potential of young people, the innovation and creativity of young people. And so we must listen to them, and not only listen, but bring them on board, so that it's not just about pretending to listen, but listen, reason with them, brainstorm with them, and then take decisions with them and implement the decisions together.
Thank you. I think also we speaking kind of as youth, also maybe in this liminal space still as well. But I think maybe a lot of the youth activists that I know and stuff, we also should go and seek out these texts and read them, I think, as well, for having that constant kind of inspiration as well in times when you feel like it's a constant uphill battle. It's also very resonating to have that literature to turn to and to kind of gain new inspiration and creativity and ideas from. So we'll have to get you to write us a book list or something, or you also find some books.
Another thing to know that it's easier to relate with literature, with music, with film than to relate with raw scientific facts. And so translating even scientific climate knowledge into these things makes it not only educative, but also entertaining. And so it becomes edutainment, and with edutainment, so people are bound to learn more. And that's why I think that literature and other forms of art have a crucial role to play when it comes to climate education or environmental education or education for sustainable development.
Absolutely, yeah. And also having the different forms as well, because different forms may speak to different people. Whereas, you know, some people may find their entry point through poetry, some people may find it through
drama,
I don't know, immersive theatre, however it may be, you know.
Exactly. Fiction, theatre, drama, spoken word, poetry, music, and then film, and of course other things, even like games, gamification. Yeah. Children's books, etc., etc.
Is there another question from anyone? We have about 5 more minutes, so if there is anything that anyone would like to ask still, again, you can put it in the chat. You can also put up your hand. You can also just unmute yourself if you want to. And it can kind of cover the stuff we've spoken about just now in the Q&A, stuff from Kenneth's talk, kind of any questions you might have.
And just one little thing, Betty, when that article on youth climate activism is eventually published, I will let you know, so that if it pleases you, if it interests you, you might want to share it maybe on your network.
Yeah, perfect. That sounds great. Yeah.
Okay.
You are publishing it again through the conversation?
Yeah, I'm considering publishing it in a peer-reviewed journal.
Okay. Oh, cool. Great. Yeah. No, we'll definitely pass that along.
Okay. Thank you, Bianca.
I heard a weak little voice going. Is that? Did you want to unmute yourself? I
Sorry,
only heard a noise so far.
I'm just going to ask on this because my I have 2 Zooms on. But there was recent. I went recently to a protest about a bunch of companies auctioning off parcels of land in the Congo Basin. Do you know a bit more about what's happening with that, or? I kind of lost track of what happened with it, but it seemed quite like a big thing, that there was quite a few companies auctioning off parcels of land in the Congo Basin.
I think I will check up that story. That's very possible. I think that's true, but I think there are also other stories, similar ones that have overshadowed it, especially the auctioning from the side of the government. And one of the governments that has come into the limelight recently a lot is the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, because there was a moratorium on forest concessions. I think it was voted around 2016 or something, and it was recently lifted in a very controversial way. I think pressure from environmental groups has made it such that either they're reconsidering to bring it back in force, or maybe it has been brought back in force, but actually they are auctioning off a lot of land to oil companies, multinational oil companies originating from Europe and America for the most part. But of course, we know that the Chinese are already also present in the Congo Basin and other people, other emerging economies. And of course, and that's also a similar situation for nearly all of the countries of the Congo Basin, including my native Cameroon, in the sense that we find the governments that have very laudable ministries of environment, ministries of climate protection, but at the same time, giving a large expanses of land to multinationals, especially for monocultural production, like say rubber, timber. That has happened in Cameroon. I think not long ago too in Cameroon, the government was giving a concession to a foreign, a multinational company in one of the richest biodiversity spots in Cameroon. And so there was pressure mounted, and the Prime Minister of Cameroon had to intervene to send an order. I think that might have come from the presidency, that had to be halted. So, and these things are very common and rampant in the Congo Basin. And of course, there is an extent to which they can also be justified. The extent is also like, because there is this question that politicians and also even citizens, some citizens ask that, well, should we stop our development completely for the sake of protecting global climate, for the sake of global climate concerns, or if we do stop, or if this is the way we have to raise revenue for our development, then if we stop it, then what are the prospects that we will have funding or money from other sources? So this is like almost not news. It's very rampant in the Congo Basin, but the good news is also that there are environmental NGOs and activists and other people and civil society organizations that are very keen on these things and always bringing them to the limelight. So I'm sure you must have seen through this, but I will check to see for the specific companies, and I will not be surprised because some companies buy a lot of land that at the end they may end up having to sell back to other companies. It's possible. It's very, very possible. It happens.
Yeah, I think I also have read an article where the environmental minister was bringing these issues in, saying, you know, of course there are the environmental concerns, but you know, the right to also to you know, take decisions as a country, you know, that isn't then kind of, again, you can look at it through the sports of conservation model or this global south, global north dynamic with both global north companies investing, but also, you know, global north activists kind of trying to point the finger or something like this. Again, you see all of these kind of complexities that are at play, and that you kind of need to be so really explicit with how you talk about the issues. That was an article I saw also, I think it was actually in The Guardian, where they were talking about the Virunga rainforest and stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, any final questions? Otherwise, maybe, Kenneth, if you have a final word that you would want to share, then I would pass it over to you to do that.
Well,
you don't have to, of course.
Yeah, but I think I will. So thank you again, Bethany, and your team at RE-PEAT, not only for extending this invitation to me, but also for being the young people that you are, and then having taken up this topic as something that you devote your time to. I come from the Congo Basin, and now we have the largest peatlands on earth. I can only wish that as your organization begins to grow, that you may consider extending it in any form that is possible to include young people as being active members of your network from the Congo Basin and other basins like Amazon, and also the forest of Southeast Asia. And as we would say, luta continua. We continue the fight until we have a livable present and a livable future for all.